Jumping in at chapter 21 of Laura Hillenbrand's Unbroken, which is called Belief, and it starts on page 219. In chapter 20, we saw Louis at Ofuna, and we realized that the treatment of the prisoners of war in this camp is really, really terrible. But we also saw Louis and his fellow prisoners finding little ways to be subversive and kind of rebel against the guards, and talked a lot about the importance that held for them holding on to their humanity and their dignity. And so at the very end of the chapter, Louis and Phil were separated. Phil was sent to a different POW camp. And here we are now back in with Louis. Before we start the chapter, there's a picture here that we'll check out. It says Christmas 25, so December 25th, and then 1943. It says, Dear Louis, wherever you are, I know you want us to think of you as well and safe. May God be with you and guide you. Love from all, Mother, Dad, Pete, Sylvia, and Virginia. So this is from Louis' family. So after all this time, it would make sense for them to believe Louis were not alive anymore. But this is showing us that his family's still holding on to hope that Louis is still alive and that he's okay. And so that's kind of what our chapter is going to center around here as we start Belief. So here we go. Behind Torrance High School stood a huddle of trees. On many evenings in the months after her brother went missing, Sylvia Zamperini Flammer would drive to the school. Remember, that's Louis' sister, but she got married. Turn her car under the trees and park there, then sit in the quiet dimness alone. As the car cooled over the pavement, tears would stream down Sylvia's cheeks. Sometimes she'd let herself sob, knowing that no one would hear her. After a few minutes, she'd dab away her tears, straighten herself, and start the car again. On the drive home, she'd think of a lie to explain why her post office trip had taken again so long. She never let anyone know how frightened she was. She was really worried for Louis, but she doesn't want people to know it. In Torrance, the June 4th, 1943 telegram announcing Louis' disappearance was followed by excruciating silence, painful silence. Many weeks passed, and the military search yielded no trace of Louis, his crew, or his plane. In town, hope dissolved. When the Zamperinis went out, they saw resignation in their neighbors' faces. Inside the White House, not the White House, on Gramercy Avenue, the mood was different. In the first days after the telegram arrived, Louise Zamperini had been seized with the conviction that her son was alive. Her husband and children had felt the same. Days passed, then weeks. Spring became summer, and no word came. But the family's conviction remained unshaken. Conviction is like a strong belief. So even though there's no word or sign that Louis is alive, the family's really believing that he's okay. To the family, Louis was among them still, spoken of in the present tense as if he were just down the street, expected at any moment. What the Zamperinis were experiencing wasn't denial, and it wasn't hope. It was belief. Louise, Anthony, Pete, and Virginia still sensed Louis' presence. They could still feel him. Their distress came not from grief, but from the certainty that Louis was out there, in trouble, and they couldn't reach him. On July 13th, Louise felt a wave of urgency. She penned a letter to Major General Willis Hale, commander of the 7th Air Force. In it, she begged Hale not to give up searching. Louis, she wrote, was alive. Unbeknownst to Louise, on that same day, Louis was captured. Several weeks later, a reply came from Hale's office. The letter said that given the failure of the search to yield any clues, the military had been forced to accept that Louis and the rest of the men on the plane were gone. It was hoped, the letter said, that Louise would accept this also. Louise ripped up the letter. Pete was still in San Diego training Navy recruits. The stress wore on him. Sometimes he drove to Torrance to visit his family, and when he arrived, everyone quietly worried about how thin he was. In September, his last letter to Louis, mailed hours before his family was notified of his crash, came back to him. Scribbled on the front were the words, missing at sea. On the back, there was a stamp, casualty status verified. The photograph of Pete was still sealed in the envelope. So everything that's coming from the military back to the family is telling them that Louis has died. He died at sea in the plane crash, but they're not believing it, right? Louise ripped up the letter. She's not going to buy it. That same month, Sylvia's husband, Harvey, left for the war. He wouldn't see his wife again for 2 years. Living alone, Sylvia was racked with anxiety for her brother and her husband, and she had no one to share it with. Like Pete, she was barely able to eat. Her body had become a slender, taut line. Yearning to connect with someone, she decided to move back in with her parents. Sylvia held a yard sale to get rid of all her possessions. She had a clothes washer and dryer, both rationed items that were almost impossible to buy new. One woman wanted to buy them, but Sylvia refused in hopes that she could sell everything in one lot. The woman promptly bought the entire house's contents for $1,000 just to get the appliances. Sylvia took what little she had left and drove to Torrance. She found her father just as he had been since the news had come. Chin up, smiling bravely, sometimes through tears. Virginia, living at home and building military ships at Western Pipe and Steel, was as distraught as Sylvia. Their mother was the biggest worry. At first, Louise cried often. Then, as the months passed, she hardened down. The weeping rash on her hands, which had appeared almost the moment she'd learned of Louis' disappearance, raged. She couldn't wear gloves and could no longer do anything with her hands. Sylvia and her father took over the cooking. So remember we learned earlier in the book that whenever Louis' mom is worried about him, she would get this rash that would break out over her hands. And it's telling us now that Louis missing at sea or presumed dead, the rash is so bad that Louise can't do anything with her hands. Sylvia quit her job in a dentist's office and took a new one as a dental assistant in an army hospital, hoping that the job might give her access to information about Louis. There she heard talk of a plane shortage in the military, so she took a second job, moonlighting on the evening shift in the blueprint office of an aircraft factory. She was almost unbearably tense. One night, leaving work late, she came upon a group of workers sitting under a plane gambling. She suddenly found herself shouting at them, saying that her brother was missing. America needed planes, and here they were goofing off. Sylvia was startled by her outburst, but she didn't regret it. It made her feel better. And this is just showing us how tense all Lou's family is while they're waiting to hear if he's okay or not. Also note that Sylvia going to work for a plane manufacturing place like this is really common. You may have seen the posters of Rosie the Riveter, the little "we can do it" lady, and she was representing kind of this group of women who went and got jobs during World War II because so many men were off fighting. And this is a big shift in history of a time where we see a lot of women taking jobs outside the home, sometimes for the first time. On October 6th, Louis' army truck bumped into his parents' doorstep, heavy and final. Louise couldn't bring herself to look inside. So this is like Louis' suitcase got to their house, basically. She had it dragged to the basement and covered with a blanket. It would sit there unopened for the rest of her life. Everyone in the family was suffering, but the children wanted to insulate their mother. They never cried together, instead telling each other invented stories of Louis' adventures on a tropical island. Most of the time, Anthony simply couldn't talk about Louis. Sylvia spent a lot of time in church praying for Louis and Harvey. That's brother and husband. Sometimes she and Virginia drove to San Diego to see Pete, and they'd all go out for a drink to cheer one another up. They never discussed the possibility that Louis was dead. When Sylvia walked through downtown Torrance with her family, she noticed oblique glances from passers-by. Their expressions seemed to say that they pitied the Zamparinis for being unable to accept the truth. Every evening, Sylvia wrote a letter to her husband. Every week or so, she wrote one to Louis. She made a point of writing as if everything were normal, sharing the trivial news of home. She had an address for Harvey. For Louis, she had nothing. So she addressed his letters to the Red Cross. She'd tell her mother that she was mailing letters, get in the car, drive to the post office, and drop the letters in the box. Then she'd drive to Torrance High, park under the trees, and cry. At night, when the lights were out and she was alone in her childhood bed, Sylvia often broke down again. When sleep came, it was fitful and haunted. Because she knew nothing of what had happened to her brother, her mind latched onto the image she had seen in the newspaper after Nauru, Louis peering through a hole in the side of Superman. The image had fixed in her mind the idea of Louis being shot, and this was the point around which her nightmares circled. Never a crash, never water, only bullets bloodying Louis as he sat in his plane. Sylvia was always trying to get to Louis, but she was never able. As bad as the nightmares were, in them, Louis was never killed. Even Sylvia's imagination didn't allow for her brother's death. In December 1943, the family prepared to celebrate their first Christmas without Louis. The mailman knocked at the door each day to deliver a harvest of cards and letters, most of them offering sympathy. The holiday tree was strung with popcorn and cranberries, and beneath it sat a collection of gifts for Louis. The gifts would be tucked away in the belief that one day Louis would come home to open them himself. Louise bought a little Christmas card depicting a cherub in a red dress blowing a horn as she stood surrounded by lambs. Inside, she wrote a message. And this is what we started our chapter off with. Dear Louis, wherever you are, I know you want us to think of you as well and safe. May God be with you and guide you. Love from all. Mother, Dad, Pete, Sylvia, and Virginia. So Louis's been missing as far as they know since June. It's now December, and the family is just refusing to believe that Louis is not okay. 2 months later, after a campaign of saturation bombing, America seized Kwajalein. The island's dense jungle had been bombed away. In its place were massive craters, burned tree stumps, and churned earth. The entire island looked as if it had been picked up 20,000 feet and then dropped, said one serviceman. And remember, this is where Louis and Phil were first kept on Execution Island in the cells. In what was left of an administrative building, someone found a stack of documents. Outside, a serviceman, climbing through the remains of a wooden structure, saw something in the wreckage and dug it out. It was a long splinter of wood. Etched along the slat in capital letters was the name, Louis Zamperini. Remember, he carved his name in the cell using his belt buckle. On Oahu, Joe Deasy was summoned to Hickam Field. When he arrived, he was handed translations of some of the Japanese documents that had been taken from Kwajalein. He began to read. 2 American airmen, the document said, had been fished from a life raft and brought to Kwajalein. Their names weren't given, but they were described as a pilot and a bombardier. They'd been in a plane crash. The date was apparently provided, and 3 men had survived, but 1 had died on the raft. The other 2 had drifted for 47 days. Included among the papers were interrogation reports and drawings of B-24s made by the captive. The report stated that the men had been beaten and then sent to Japan by boat. The moment that Deasy read the report, he knew who the men were. Deasy had been long at war, and the experience had ground away his emotions, but this revelation broke through. Phillips and Zamperini had survived their crash. Deasy's elation was tailed by a sinking sense of guilt. In their painstaking search of the ocean, they had missed seeing the lost men, but the enemy had not. Remember, Deasy had been helping to look for Phil and Louis, and they had never found them. But he's realizing while they missed them, the Japanese found them and took them as prisoners of war. I was happy to have found them, Deasy recalled, but the next thing is, where the hell are they? If the report of their transport to Japan was correct, it still didn't mean they had gotten there alive or that they had survived whatever lay in store for them there. The military now knew with a fair amount of certainty that everyone who had gone up on Green Hornet, with the exception of Zamperini and Phillips, was dead. Apparently, because of the sketchiness of the reports and the fact that Louis and Phil's fates were still unknown, the families of the dead and the 2 missing weren't notified. Like the Zamperinis, the Phillips family had been largely in the dark since Alan had disappeared. Remember, Alan is Phil, is his first name. Alan's father was at Camp Pickett in Virginia. His mother, Kelsey, rattled around in her empty house in Princeton, Indiana. After the telegram informing them that Alan was missing, they received a letter from an adjutant from the 42nd Squadron, giving details on how Alan had disappeared. The adjutant wrote with a tone of finality, speaking of your hour of grief, noting that Alan will always be revered by the members of this organization, and offering to extend myself to you to ease your sorrow. The next month, a package came to Alan's father at Camp Pickett. In it were 2 bronze oak leaf clusters awarded to Alan for his valor in the missions of Macon, Tarawa, and Nauru. Pending final determination of your son's status, the cover letter read, the oak leaf clusters are being sent to you for safekeeping. So, since we don't know where your son is and he might not be alive, we're sending you his medals. Though the Phillipses didn't know it, the medals arrived the same week Alan was captured. Chaplain Phillips, Alan's dad, wanted to send the oak leaf clusters to his wife, but feared losing them in the mail, so he kept them with him in Virginia. He took a picture of them, along with Alan's service ribbons, wings, insignia, and air medal, attached the picture to a maroon piece of felt he'd kept from a lady's hat, and glued the felt to a walnut plaque. When he got back to Indiana, he planned to attach the actual medals and ribbons to the felt and stand the plaque on the bookcase under Alan's picture. "It certainly is swell," he wrote to his daughter. In the absence of information, all the Phillipses could do was ponder what little they knew. They, like the Zamparinis, refused to conclude that their boy was dead. "I think I have thought of every conceivable angle to what Alan did, and I have not dismissed any of them from my mind yet," Chaplain Phillips wrote to his daughter in August. "So many things could be true about it that they build up for me a feeling of confidence that will not be shaken. Someday we're all going to have that reunion we're hoping and waiting for." So like Louie's family, Phil's family is still believing that Phil's alive. And here we see Cece, Phil's fiance that we've heard so much about. Phil writing to her. Here she is. For Cece Perry, the news that her fiance was missing was followed by a letter from her old friend Smitty, one of the pilots who had searched for Green Hornet. In his letter, Smitty told Cece everything that was known about Alan's disappearance and how dedicated the searchers were to finding him. He didn't tell her that he had seen what had probably been the provisions box for the lost plane floating by itself on the ocean. He wrote about having sat with Alan on the night before he disappeared, and how Alan had been thinking of her and hoping to get leave to see her. After Smitty's letter, no news came. Cece, desperate for information, felt isolated in Indiana. One of her friends was living in a suburb of Washington, D.C., and Cece thought that in the capital she could find out more about Alan. She gave up teaching, traveled east, and moved into her friend's apartment, which she decorated with pictures of Alan. She got a job with TWA, thinking that through the airline she might learn something. She spent much of her time asking questions, but learned nothing. Cece was a sensible, educated woman, but in her anguish, like her sadness and pain, she did something completely out of character. She went to a fortune teller and asked about Alan. The fortune teller told her that Alan wasn't dead. He was injured, but alive. He would be found, she said, before Christmas. Cece latched onto those words and believed them. So once again, everyone just has this sense that Louie and Phil are still alive. By the spring of 1944, the mothers of the Green Hornet crewmen, as well as the other family members, had begun to correspond. In dozens of letters that crisscrossed America, they shared their emotions and bolstered each other's hopes about our boys. Kelsey would later say that she came to love all of them through those letters. So all of these, like the family of the crew members, start to send each other letters, share the little bits of information that they've gotten, and they try to give each other hope while they don't know what happened to their kids. "This year sure has been an awful long year, just waiting for some word from them," wrote Delia Robinson, the sister of Green Hornet gunner Otto Anderson, that June. "We just have to keep on hoping." The waiting had taken its toll on crewman Leslie Dean's mother, Mabel. Her failing health had sent her to Wichita for weeks of treatment, but she, like the others, had not given up. "We thought surely we would have heard something when the year was up," she wrote to Louise, "so it seems they are not sure the crew were killed, or they would have notified us long before this, so I feel we can still have hope of them being alive somewhere." So we see that the whole crew has family members who are hopeful that they're still alive. We know that only Louie and Phil survived, but the whole crew is hoping that that can be true for all of the boys. Mabel Dean wrote those words on June 27, 1944. On that very day, exactly 13 months after Green Hornet had gone down, messages were typed up at the War Department and sent to the families of the plane's crewmen. When Louise Zamparini's message reached her door, she opened it and burst into tears. The military had officially declared Louie and all the other crewmen dead. Kelsey Phillips was not persuaded. She either learned or guessed that the LaPorte Herald-Argus, the newspaper of their former hometown, would publish the news. She contacted the paper and asked them not to print the death notice. Her son, she told them, was not gone. The editors honored her request. Russell Allen Phillips had officially been declared dead, but no obituary appeared. So here we have Phil's mom still saying, "I don't believe it. I believe my son's alive. Don't post the notice in the newspaper that he died. I want to believe that there's still hope." The feeling in the Zamperini home was the same as in the Phillipses. When the initial shock from the death notice faded, all of the Zamperinis realized that it changed nothing. The notice had been generated as a bureaucratic matter of course, a designation made for all missing servicemen after 13 months had passed. Louis's official death date was listed as May 28, 1944, a year and a day after his plane had vanished. The notice was just a piece of paper. None of us believed it, none of us, Sylvia would say, never once, not underneath even. Inside themselves, the Zamperinis still felt that persistent little echo of Louis, the sense that he was still in the world somewhere. Until it was gone, they would go on believing that he was alive. During family dinners, Pete and his father began drawing up plans to hunt for Louis. When the war was over, they'd rent a boat and sail from island to island until they found him. They'd go on for as long as it took. And on that note, while we know Louis is still alive but his family does not, we will pause and get ready for chapter 22.